Alright everyone, hello, this is My Two Cents, and welcome back to my channel for another live video debunking with my longtime friend and patron, Nightshift 10,000. Say hello, Nightshift.
Yo, what's up?
Alright, so today we're going to be reviewing a video I honestly never thought I'd have to review, but it should be interesting. Lauren Southern, who I have always been a big fan of, I should say up front, Lauren Southern is actually one of the initial YouTubers who inspired me to start my own YouTube channel. I like a lot of her content. Obviously, I don't agree with her on everything. But I was quite surprised when she published a video about 10 days ago called A Conservative Critique of Capitalism. Now, I have watched it from beginning to end. I disagree with... Well, I'm going to say up front, I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of what she says, but I do disagree with what I think is the implied solution a lot of times. And what's interesting is even at the end of this critique, she asks the question, so what's the solution? And admits she doesn't really have a lot of great answers. I, however, think I might, and I think Nightshift might have some input there. Not that I would have perfect answers, but I just want to give some feedback to her video and its critique of capitalism as a libertarian and an anarcho-capitalist. So without further ado, let's go ahead and see what Lauren Southern, a YouTuber who previously ran for political office in Canada as a libertarian, has to say about capitalism.
First of all, I would like to give a warm welcome to all of the people who are here for the first 10 seconds of the video to leave a dislike and an angry response calling me a communist before even watching it. And goodbye. All right, now that that's out of the way.
Okay, Lauren, I'm just going to say I'm going to play this video in its entirety because for that exact reason. Anybody like that who, whether you're a libertarian, a conservative, or a fan of capitalism, as I believe you should be, if you just click on the video, hit dislike, and leave, that's ridiculous. You're not giving her a fair shake.
Yeah, geez, projecting much, Lauren? I mean, wow.
Comrades, working men and working women, collective farmers, brothers and sisters, guerrillas, we must fight for the socialist revolution. Fight to the end until the complete victory of the proletariat and the overthrow of the international bourgeoisie. Long live the worldwide social... Seriously, people. You do not have to join the Red Army to recognize that capitalism has some problems. You can even love it and realize this. But the truth is, one could create the greatest system in the universe, but as soon as you insert humans, said system will have issues. Check out the Guardian.
Okay, now here I want to say up front, when I say capitalism, what I mean by that is people freely exchanging the things that belong to them, absent of coercion. I would agree with Lauren. As soon as you insert people into any system, there are going to be problems, but the problems are going to stem from the people, not necessarily the system. I can't think of anything inherent to... If by what we mean is capitalism, is people voluntarily exchanging what belongs to them, absent the coercion and the use of force, I don't see what you're going to say is wrong with... There's something inherently wrong with people voluntarily engaging in mutually beneficial exchanges, absent the coercion of force. I mean, I'm missing something, Nightshift?
No. Here's the thing. Honestly, all systems are going to have their problems. Capitalism is by no means a utopian system by any amount, and I know of no anarcho-capitalists that actually believe that. It's more about what is better and what has less... what has less negative outcomes. And at least as far as we've seen, capitalism is the best system so far by which for humans to economically interact with each other. So, I mean, yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but then nothing is. Like,
But what makes it not perfect is the initiation of force. People engaging in the use of force to coerce people into giving them things that don't belong to them and that they would not voluntarily cede. Now that is a problem. That is going to be a problem no matter where you live, no matter what era it is. But that's a problem that stems from people, not from capitalism, which is just people voluntarily exchanging the things that belong to them, absent the coercion of force.
Yeah.
All right. Simp Slayer asks the question, did she make this video recently? The answer is yes, it came out on May 1st. All right, let's continue.
Garden of Eden. We suck. Especially when we were given the freedom to suck. I'm not sure when exactly this Republican worship of capitalism began, but it is a problem, and it needs to stop.
Personally, I don't believe Republicans worship capitalism. Republicans are among the greatest number of people calling for more government regulation these days, especially when it comes to like breaking up the tech giants and other things, which, you know, that's a discussion we're not going to get into right now. But I don't see Republicans worshiping capitalism any more than Democrats do. Both of them want to use the power of government to force people to do the things they want. They just disagree about what government should do with its power.
Exactly.
Capitalism is just a system of economics. It is not a god, it's not a moral system, and it's not going to save us. And in fact, in its current highly toxic form, has arguably been the downfall of both traditionalism and conservatism in many ways. And coincidentally, is the most powerful weapon currently used by radical socialist activists who seemingly have given up the class war in favor of winning the culture war hand in hand with big corporations.
All right, now here's a quick moment for me to insert what I have coined my own law, 2 cents law, and that is anytime someone seeks out to criticize capitalism, they will first criticize something that is really government, and then 2, they will advocate even more government power to fix the problem.
Exactly.
And I think, unfortunately, that is what Lauren's going to do here.
Yeah, honestly, again, she is making the cardinal sin here of conflating corporatism with capitalism. They are not the same.
Which, yes, and I think later on she does acknowledge this, but she doesn't flush it out to the degree I wish she would have.
Yeah.
So let's jump right into it and go through the 3 main problems I have here and why. 1. The amount of power corporations have is too damn high.
Yes.
I have a lot in common with libertarians. I ran for the Libertarian Party. I generally want to be left alone and not have the foot of the state constantly on my throat. However, where I tend to part ways with my libertarian friends is I think there are significantly more threats to our freedoms than just the state, such as the many violent, non-government authoritarian criminals and foreign terrorist groups that exist. All people...
Okay, here, as always, we need to discuss what exactly is a state. A state is a group of individuals that claims a monopoly on the use of force in a given territory. The mob is a state. You know, the government of just about every nation is a state. But terrorists, here, a lot of people talk about, you know, government and terrorist groups and criminal organizations and treat these things like they're all fundamentally separate entities. In my opinion, no. If they claim a monopoly on the use of force, then by definition, they are a state. Now, granted, you can have competing states. You can have 2 different groups of individuals who are competing for said monopoly over a given territorial region. But when an otherwise voluntary organization picks up guns and starts trying to coerce people into doing what they want, they have by definition become a state. So... But go ahead.
Okay. No, well, and I didn't mean to cut you off there, but oh, geez, she's talking about terrorist organizations. Does she mean like Al Qaeda and ISIS? You know, terrorist organizations that were created by the state, by the government, namely ours, to basically fight other terrorist groups and then became terrorists? Is that what she's talking about? Oh gosh, let's get the government in on that one again. Maybe they'll create a group to fight ISIS that, oh no, they'll become a terrorist regime again. Yeah, and using the state to clean up the state's mistakes. It ain't working, Lauren. Sorry.
But and certainly there are plenty of that's another rabbit trail we don't really need to go down right now. But whether government funding of terrorist organizations like, you know, Osama bin Laden was given all kinds of weapons and money by the CIA back in the late 1970s, was it early 80s, and then he went on to create Al Qaeda. But it's been said one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. any organization that is seeking to use force and gain a monopoly of force over a given territory is a state. Now, is every state as bad as every other? Of course not. But I think that I think there are a lot of false dichotomies here. Republican, Democrats, socialist, capitalist. Really, fundamentally, there's statist and anarchist, in my opinion. You either think the use of force is legitimate or you don't. And if you try to argue that some use of force is inherently justified, you end up, you're never going to be able to consistently argue why only you and your select group of people are justified in using force, but everyone else is not. All right, we'll keep going.
People I don't particularly want entering my country or running around freely. Libertarians will often disagree with me and respond by saying, sure, Lauren, violent people exist, but they are just not as big a threat as the all-powerful state is to our freedoms. Therefore, no matter the potential benefits of the state in stopping or reducing other evils, it must be abolished or at least severely reduced, because they are the bigger problem, which, fair enough. Deal with the greatest threat to freedoms first. The only problem here, though, is that the government is no longer the 800-pound gorilla. It's more like an organ grinder's monkey dancing to corporate music. Western governments are largely controlled by corporate lobbying pressure, campaign donations, and now even censorship of politicians we once would have thought were more powerful than said corporations.
Okay, but again, is the source of that problem people voluntarily exchanging the things belonging to them? Because that's all that capitalism is. Or if there was no government to buy off, would these corporations have any power in and of themselves? That's a lot of the conservative leaning, or those that identify as conservative as opposed to libertarians, say, yes, I love capitalism, but big corporations have too much power because they're lobbying the government.
Right.
If there was no government, there would be no lobbyists.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And you could say, well, if there was no government, these corporations would just hire their own mercenaries and go out and start initiating force themselves. To which I say yes, and at that moment, they have by definition ceased to be a corporation and are now a state.
A state, exactly. That is, if they could even survive the collapse of the state itself and the loss of the corporate welfare that they feed off of. So even that might be in jeopardy for them.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing that sustains this is the public's persistent belief that the government is somehow legitimate in its use of force, but no one else is. If McDonald's hires a private military contractor to go out and start collecting taxes so that they can build more restaurants around the world, do you think anyone's just going to stand for this, or are they going to pick up their own guns and resist? On the other hand, when IRS agents come to your house not literally, but if you don't pay your taxes, eventually armed IRS agents are going to come to your house. But people say, and people generally speaking just pay their taxes and don't question it because they perceive the one group of people to be legitimate, while the other group of people is illegitimate. But again, fundamentally, what's the difference? The government says, pay us taxes and we'll protect you in return. The mafia says, you pay us protection money and we'll protect you in return. What fundamentally is the difference? What is the consistent reason that a group of people in Washington, D.C. or London or wherever else are justified in doing this, but another group of people in some other city who aren't in a Greek-looking building don't have the legitimacy to do this? What is the consistent reason why group X is legitimate and group Y is not? You're not going to be able to provide a consistent reason.
Exactly.
And the worst part about the corporations having this power is we didn't elect them. And no, we didn't vote for them with our dollar either. I'm sure a lot of us would much rather go to our local shops and hire our neighbors for jobs over some faceless, nameless corporation. But unfortunately, it's becoming near impossible to compete with global monopolies utilizing slave labor to drive down prices while we have to adhere to reasonable local labor laws. Not to mention,
and again, where did those laws come from? Did the corporations themselves issue these edicts, or was it the government which they lobbied? And again, if there was no government, who would they be lobbying? And if they hire their own mercenaries, they cease to be a corporation and are now a government.
Exactly.
All the government grants, tax cuts, and favoritism for big business elites. It is simply not possible to compete which is tragic for hardworking small businesses and medium businesses, which I, and I'm sure many of you, really support.
I do.
Now, I know what you're thinking. I know what you are all thinking. Lauren, this is not real capitalism you are talking about. This is crony capitalism.
Yes, crony capitalism, corporatism, fascism, call it what you will. Again, the problem, all the problems she's talking about are not stemming from capitalism, which is simply people voluntarily exchanging the things that belong to them. The problem is the initiation of force, which is something that only government can get away with, because people have been tricked into believing that there is this this all-powerful entity, that it's okay when government initiates force, but it's wrong when everyone else does. Never mind, I'll never give you a consistent reason why.
Yeah.
And you'd be absolutely right. But here's the kicker. Real capitalism has never been tried. Just like how real communism has never been tried.
Now, here, I'm going to disagree here. When we say real capitalism has never been tried, and by that, if we're talking about a stateless system where people voluntarily exchanged the things that belong to them, what do you think mankind was doing before the first governments came around? I mean, when the farmer living in the middle of nowhere who grows his crops to support his family, is he not? No, granted, if there's no one to exchange with, he's not necessarily engaging in voluntary transactions, but he's engaging in labor and reaping the fruits of his own labor. We can talk about medieval Iceland. We can talk about the American Wild West, which wasn't so wild, by the way. Those are all rabbit trails I don't need to go down right now. But the real capitalism has never been tried. Real capitalism is just people voluntarily exchanging the things that belong to them. Now, if you mean there's never been a time in history where the threat of the use of force didn't exist, of course you're right on that. People are always going to use force. It can't be avoided. But the problem there is, as soon as you convince the entire population that it's wrong for everyone to use force but this group of people over here, that's when you have a problem. There is not a state in the world that would be able to survive if all its people suddenly turned on it.
Exactly. And even in that case, even if we want to go there in modern day, well, what do you think the black and gray markets do? I mean, what do you think they're for? They are the actual capitalism that is being tried, that's unregulated. And right now, in a lot of ways, they are really hitting the government hard because, there's no taxation, there's no regulation. And those black and gray markets are operating very well without any kind of government support and without any kind of government hindrance. Even though the government's trying to hinder them, it's doing a really bad job, thankfully so. So I mean, it is being tried, and the thing about it is it's working really, really well. So yeah, make of that what you will.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, even when you compare countries, I'm not going to say every state is as bad as every other state. No, you can absolutely look at a state like communist China compared to the current state of the United States, and which unfortunately is looking more and more like communist China every day. But still, nonetheless, I'm going to be fair. In the current form, I'd rather be living in the United States than in China. Yeah. But it has to do with how much force. I would argue the difference is how much force is that state exerting over its citizens. We can look at a state like the United States, Canada, the UK. We can look at a state like China, or the extremely failing states like Venezuela, Cuba, Lebanon, and say, which one would you rather live in? What's the difference? It's not the use of force itself, but the degree to which the government seeks to use force to control certain enterprises. And the more control it seeks to exert, generally the worse it gets.
Right.
Both of these theories and systems on a large scale are ahistorical constructs. We have never lived in a world where millions of people have had to share with each other the way a family does. And we have never lived in a world where everyone buys and sells from each other with no restrictions or aggression from anyone else. So if we want to deal with reality, what we have to examine is how capitalism has actually worked in history. And to my libertarians, a little side note, if you need to mentally put the word crony in front of capitalism for the rest of this talk to get through it, that's perfectly fine. Like I said, You're not wrong, but I'm speaking to the system in place today that Republicans often defend as capitalism.
And again, the element that is screwing it up is government, the initiation of force. Not it's like saying there's a problem with voluntary interactions when people start using force. Yeah, and that's when people start using force. So why are you saying I'm criticizing voluntary interactions?
Right.
And history tells us that this system can absolutely lead to brutal, authoritarian, and freedom-threatening results.
Again, I'm really struggling to see how people voluntarily engaging in mutually beneficial exchanges with the things that belong to them is necessarily going to lead to authoritarianism.
Right. And here's the thing. Even if she is talking about crony capitalism, say what you will about it, it's at least better than socialism and state capitalism. So, there is that to be said. Even though it is still technically a perversion of capitalism, it's still better than those.
Mm-hmm. And if you're saying what you're criticizing is not capitalism but crony capitalism, then what you are in fact criticizing is government.
Right.
So, well, keep going.
As it is quickly doing so today. Corporations have the power to politically manipulate populations, to deny us our speech, and even to control our thoughts and feelings through algorithms. That is terrifying. And despite this, you still have Republicans out here defending it as just a private company. And another peep you may hear from them in defense of our corporate overlords is, well, at least they can't throw you in jail. At least they won't put you against a firing wall or start wars. Yeah, sorry. That just doesn't quite line up with history either. I could do a whole video on private war profiteering. And massive companies and corporations like...
Okay, private war profiteering. Again, I'd like to see, and she could have one. I'm by no means an expert of history. I'd be willing to examine, if she does make this video, I'll be willing to examine the examples that she gives. But in these cases of private war profiteering, tell me, when it comes to mercenaries, where is the money paying them coming from? Yeah. Is it coming from, where is an example in history where private citizens pay a private army to invade some other group of private citizens? Or is it, in fact, government taxing its people and then paying a quote-unquote private army to go do its bidding? And Ryan McMacken at the Mises Institute wrote a great article where he talked about the privatization of the war in Afghanistan. I think it was just a couple of years ago. And, everyone's been talking lately about how President Biden says, I'm going to pull all the troops out of Afghanistan. And he did say that, but if you look at the websites of some of these big military contractors, they are still hiring private contractors to go and fill combat roles in Afghanistan. So all that's functionally changing is instead of the U.S. military, the federally sanctioned military operating in Afghanistan, we now have a quote-unquote private company that is getting paid taxpayer money to go do what the U.S. military was previously doing. Functionally, there's no difference. The government is still paying people to do its bidding. It's just it calls one the federal military while it calls the other private contractors. They're men with guns who are getting paid government money to do the government's bidding. Explain to me what the fundamental difference is.
Oh, and here's the thing. It even gets better. I think it was in Iraq. Back when the war in Iraq was going on, it's actually still unfortunately going on. But back during the Bush years or the Obama years, I forget which one. They were hiring private soldiers, privately contracted soldiers, to go into that war zone as well and to fight in the stead of the federal military. And the reason for that is because they could disregard constitutional standards on warfare and go around those rules if they had a private military doing the work. So even there, the state's willing to do that just to get around its own rules. So even that's even more insidious that the state's willing to do that. So yeah.
The state makes one group of rules for its own technical employees, but then it makes a different set of rules for private employees. But again, the difference here is totally made up. In both cases, whether it's the U.S. military, whether it's a private contractor, it's a group of armed individuals who are receiving federal tax dollars to do the state's bidding.
Right.
The Dutch East India Company not only kept and sold slaves, but had private militaries larger than entire countries' militaries, and eventually became so powerful they could invade and become the acting government in areas in which.
Did you hear that? Become the acting government. Again, anytime a corporation takes up arms and seeks to use force, it ceases to be a corporation. It is now a government or a state. So, again, criticizing capitalism, saying if there was no government, corporations might become governments, is like saying if there was no government, a government might rise up. I mean, it's a true statement, but it's hardly a meaningful observation. It's, yes, government is a problem. Yes, you are never going to completely eliminate the threat that a government might rise up and trample on the rights of its people. My question, and the same question I've been asking the status over and over again, why is it that your particular government has the right to use force, but no one else does? And further, once you give your government the power to use force, how are you going to ensure it only does the things you want it to do? Right. The classic example, the conservative who says, I want the government to stop people from using drugs because drugs are bad for them. And if we didn't have a government, fighting the war on drugs, a lot of people think of all the innocent people who are going to die from overdosing on drugs.
Right.
Okay, but then what happens? These people are typically, the average conservative is typically a religious individual who cares a lot about their child's education and doesn't want them learning about evolution or critical race theory or pick your particular issue that's taken place throughout history. What happens when the government comes along and says your child is going to go to school and they're going to learn about something that you think is immoral or wrong, but that they think is perfectly legitimate and every child needs to learn whether their parents want to or not? Well, the conservative says that's an abuse of government authority. Really? According to whom? The people on the opposite side of the political aisle legitimately believe that teaching traditional religious values to children is just as harmful as doing drugs or whatever else. They're sincere in their belief that what they're doing is right. How are you going to consistently argue that only you have the right to use force, but they don't? You can say I'm right all day long. They believe they're right too.
It's very much like the Voltaire quote, and I might be misquoting him here. I'm not sure, but it's literally like Voltaire quoted: "If there were no God, it would be necessary to invent him." That's literally like what she's saying, or literally kind of the argument that she's making right now is literally just that. If there were no God or if there were no government, it would be necessary to invent one. Well, why? Why exactly do that when it's what created the problem in the first place? Yeah.
And No Leaf Clover says here, but East India Trading Company was a state-sanctioned monopoly. Exactly.
Yes.
Give me an example of just one of these corporations that didn't collaborate with the government in order to gain its power. And again, even you can say, well, if there was no government, they'd just hire their own mercenaries. And again, at that point, they've become a government. Government is the problem here. Government is what will always be a threat. Why are you then criticizing capitalism?
Right.
Which they had business interests. To pretend that if we just abolished the government, none of these corporations would ever even think to oppress us, to fill that power vacuum and take away our liberties, is madness. In fact, there is already legislation being proposed to allow Nevada tech companies to form their own governments and cities. So people, if
sanctioned by the government,
and you don't like big government, you really should be just as worried about big corporations, because they don't want to uphold systems which made them wealthy, as those very systems may allow for their replacement and failure. And thus, they want to become your government and eliminate competition and question. And I fear that these mega corporations are getting very close to that.
Okay, and I'd say the only defense against this is ridding people of the widespread belief that government is itself legitimate. Until you do that, you are always going to have this problem. But whatever powers you try to grant to government to restrict these other governments, really, if you're afraid, if we didn't have a government, the corporation would become a government. And if we did have a government, the corporation would buy off that government. Again, the problem is the initiation of force. That is what the problem is.
Go ahead. Keep going.
I'm under no delusion. I don't think that by by having an anarcho-capitalist YouTube channel, by preaching the principles of liberty, I and anyone else who agrees with me are going to somehow magically take away the threat of the use of the initiation of force. It's always a threat that's gonna be there. But I would say your best chance of keeping it at bay is convincing people that no, you don't have to. The initiation of force is illegitimate. It's your government is illegitimate. You don't have to listen to what they have to say. So long as people are trapped in that delusion, whether it's the current government, whether it's some future government, whether it's a corporation who later takes up arms and becomes the government, that will always be the threat. And the reason governments around the world are so eager to control information, control new media sources, crack down on free speech platforms, is they know the greatest threat to them is and always will be their own people wising up and realizing, why do we have to listen to these people? What makes them legitimate?
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Well, and I even say this again, that is also assuming that these corporations can survive the collapse of a government and having to compete fairly in a free and open market, especially in an unleashed market and in an unleashed capitalistic free market where all these smaller companies are coming up and basically outpricing them, outselling them, and outbusinessing them. Basically, that's assuming that these corporations could survive that collapse and the loss of the corporate welfare and the corporatization that they need to, from the government to literally survive. I mean, honestly, if you wanted my best guesstimate on how long companies or corporations like Facebook, Amazon, or Windows would survive in a completely free and open market, I'd give them about a week. Or maybe a month at the most after the collapse of the government, after the loss of corporatization that they need to survive. I would give them a month at the most before they would fall apart as corporations.
Exactly. And especially all the employees who currently work for those corporations, once there is no longer a state, what stops them from saying to their bosses, I don't need you, I'm going to go start my own corporation.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to add quick what the quote you mentioned that's attributed to Voltaire about if there was not a God, it would be necessary to invent one. I think it is extremely telling that throughout much of history, governments around the world have always claimed some kind of divine authority given from God, whether it's the ancient Mesopotamian or Egyptian cultures where the pharaoh or the leader is literally said to be descended from the gods, or whether it's a modern government that talks about that, like the UK, where the Queen is said to be the head of the Church of England, or whatever else. Governments necessarily try to wrap themselves in religion, in that people recognize that they have no more right to use force against another person than any other person does. It's only if they can somehow convince the people that this one group of persons has been anointed by God himself that people go along with it.
Exactly.
So instead of daddy government on our throats, we'll just have, Google soldiers TM putting us up against firing walls for illegally downloading Gab or Parler to their devices and sharing our Netflix account with more than 10 friends.
In which case, Google is the government.
Let's move on, because this second one is a far more important point, and that is capitalism's destruction of community and culture. I often see many on the right lamenting the loss of old traditional architecture, community, family,
and
art,
here we go.
and yet at the same time proposing capitalism as a solution. It's not even a little bit. Capitalism has no incentive to preserve our culture or communities. And in fact...
Okay, capitalism has no incentive. Again, capitalism is just people voluntarily exchanging the things that belong to them in mutually beneficial exchanges where there is no coercion or use of force. When you say capitalism has no incentive, of course it doesn't. Capitalism is just people voluntarily exchanging the things that belong to them. The people have incentives. Capitalism does not.
And I wanted to mention, Spirited actually mentioned this earlier on in the chat, but he or she's comment is really starting to show. And yes, it is true. She is a traditionalist. She is a Christian moralist. And the thing about it is that capitalism, especially even free market capitalism, I'm not going to lie, it does not really align with that, because within the bounds of free market capitalism, if you truly believe in that, or if you believe in capitalism really, then you have to also factor in that it does how do I say it? Things like pornography, gambling, prostitution. These are part of capitalism. These are part of the capitalist system, and they should very well be. The thing about it is that Christian moralists, traditionalists, and whatnot, usually rail against these industries because they're the sin industries, they're the devil industries. But the fact of the matter is, they are part of the capitalist economic model. And again, I do not condemn that. They actually should be. They actually should be part of that because they're part of the market too. And people like her really do not align with that. And so, I mean, she's more than likely in this video going to use her beliefs in tradition and Christianity to basically say, well, I don't like it, so it's something of the devil, it's something sinful, and it's capitalism's fault, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, that's really how, that's why I was saying, oh, here we go, was literally because of that. She's going to try to use those beliefs to try and say, well, capitalism is an evil, flawed system that has to be gotten rid of for our traditions and our culture and our morality, blah, blah, blah. So,
and here, I think incidentally, I think the question of traditional values and morality can be addressed independently of capitalism. Whether or not it is moral to watch a porno, to do drugs, I think you can have the debate as to whether or not that is moral. The question is, should you use force to stop people from doing those things, or should you allow people to face the natural consequences of their actions and then allow them to either wise up? And because the traditionalists, I'm going to say here, I have many traditional values myself. I believe in family. I believe that doing drugs is generally stupid and is going to lead to a lot of negative consequences in your life. But the reason I believe that is because I think people who do excessive amounts of drugs are in fact, it's going to be difficult for them to hold down a job. They're probably going to OD, and they're either going to get with the program or they're going to end up dead in the street. And when they end up dead in the street, that is their fault, and they got what they deserved for facing the natural consequences of their own actions. I would say the traditionalist, if they are right, needs to do nothing more than allow people to engage in these vices and then not help them when they when they face the natural consequences of their actions. The problem is when you introduce a government that's job is to help people, to save them from themselves. You've got welfare programs. You have individuals that are not working, doing drugs most of their day, but also being sustained by a public social safety net that basically allows them to keep doing drugs and not working for longer than they otherwise would be able to. Which, if you are a traditionalist and you believe doing drugs is immoral, which system is really more moral? Allowing people to face the natural consequences of their action, or trying to force them to do otherwise, which essentially allows them to do it even longer and get away with it? If you really think that pointing guns at people is just going to stop them from doing drugs or watching porn or whatever else you think is immoral, get real. And again, once you put the government in place and tell it, then say this is the proper role of government, is to decide for people what is best for them other than themselves, how exactly are you going to complain when that same government decides that your child needs to learn about evolution and transgenderism and critical race theory and whatever else you disagree with? You can't say, if the power of government is itself legitimate, then you can't complain when the government uses that power to do things you don't like. You can't have your cake and eat it too. It's again, the rules for me, but not for thee. So I would say traditionalism is not incompatible with capitalism. I'd say if you do believe in traditional values, then you should believe that freedom will demonstrate the truthfulness of those values.
Exactly. And what I was going to say is prohibitions, they always fail.
I'd argue has negatively impacted families. I think where this confusion comes in is some people observe that Marxism works in opposition to capitalism and to deconstruct the nuclear family, and assume, therefore, capitalism must be working to oppose Marxism and to support the family.
Well, on this point, I would say it's not. Does Marxism oppose the family? Yes, of course it does. But it's not just Marxism uniquely. The state necessarily opposes the family. The family is a product of voluntarism. Men and women get together and have children because it's a mutually beneficial exchange that benefits everyone involved. If you want to watch my video series defending traditional marriage, I think I've made a pretty good argument for this. On the other hand, the state, it does and will always have an incentive to tear the family apart. Men who are desiring to protect their families and will band together to do so are the greatest threat to the government. The government knows it's not going to be fighting women and children if its people ever rebel. It's going to be the men who are desiring to protect their families. Stay-at-home mothers do not provide taxable income. Children who have involved parents who love them are going to be much less susceptible to state indoctrination. So yeah, it is the state. Does Marxism, of course, being a form of statism, absolutely does, but states inevitably will. I'm prepared. I've made an argument in my video series. I'm prepared to show otherwise. But any government that seeks to expand its power over the people necessarily will try to break the family apart. So I would say, the family is itself a function of voluntarism. Government will always be against the family.
And on another note, I mean, okay, so she's saying that, Marxism, it's been shown to break up the traditional family. It's been shown to break up, traditional values. But then she's going on another note and saying, well, people assume that capitalism doesn't, but I'm assuming she's going to say that it does. So what economic system is she willing to espouse if it's not capitalism or communism? Which economic system does she want to go with? What is she proposing as an alternative to both?
I agree, and I think she will get to that at the end, but I think her answer will be kind of telling as to why her entire criticism is misplaced.
All right.
But capitalism is not Marxism's counter. It came about before Marxism and is therefore indifferent to it.
Hey, wait a minute. Didn't she say earlier on that real capitalism has never been tried?
Yeah. What the heck?
Doesn't that go? Isn't what she just said exactly against that? She said capitalism came about before Marxism, and I would agree it did. But again, right. The term capitalism, the modern economics has changed quite a bit. But at its core, when I say capitalism, and as a quick aside, a lot of libertarians I know have been arguing very aggressively that we need to stop using the term capitalism and start using the term voluntarism. And I think there is some merit to that argument, but at the end of the day, I'm not a big fan of arguing semantics. People know the word capitalism, so I'm still comfortable using it. And if you look at in any mainstream economics textbook, capitalism is still just, at its core, people voluntarily exchanging things that belong to them. An economic system based on the private ownership of goods and services and the free exchange thereof. That has existed since the dawn. People have been doing that since the dawn of time.
Exactly.
Historically, when did the first civilization arise? Mesopotamia, the first major civilization we can find in history. Mankind was around for hundreds of thousands of years before that. You really think no one was voluntarily exchanging the things that belonged to them beforehand?
That it would seem almost preposterous to actually think that.
Exactly.
It's simply an alternate system. And while that system can certainly bolster some people's family lives and wealth and material goods, capitalism only moderates for the markets and not for the souls and well-being of its workers.
Okay, and incidentally, I don't think its purpose ever was to do so.
No, it wasn't. She's really grabbing at things here. No, its purpose was never to do that at all. I mean, yeah, that's more of an argument from emotion right there than anything else.
Mm-hmm. And again, you can say capitalism will not save people's souls. Well, of course it won't. If you're a Christian, you believe only Jesus can do that. If you believe in some other religion, presumably you have some kind of answer. But while we can talk about how economics and religion overlap, I think it's like trying to answer it's like a scientist trying to answer political policy question or an economist trying to answer a scientific question. It's you're overlapping different fields that they overlap, they're not directly related to one another. They're separate systems, and I just don't see it. The purpose of economics was never to save people's souls. So
right.
There is a reason defenders of capitalism talk about how people can't eat in communist societies, because capitalism is really, really good at creating surpluses of goods for physical needs. But does it serve, I don't know, your safety needs? Not really. Your financial security can be wiped away any minute by the stock market. Does it serve needs relating to love and belonging? No, because having a wife or a husband...
And again, I'd say category error. No, it doesn't, but it was never meant to. Are those important questions? Of course they're important questions, but they're not economic questions per se. I mean, when we talk about material needs, sure, but love, belonging, esteem, self-actualization, the higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Here's what I forget who initially made this quote. It was either Einstein or another famous scientist. But basically, it was that scientists tend to make lousy philosophers, and the point was science answers the question what. It cannot tell you necessarily why. Science can tell you how to make a nuclear bomb. Science cannot tell you whether or not it is morally right to set off said nuclear bomb. So, and same thing, economics, we can study different economic systems and tell you which one is better at producing material surpluses. Whether or not those material surpluses are good for society, whether they're moral or immoral, that's a question, that's not an economic question, it's a philosophical one. An important one to be sure, but not one that is going to be solved by studying economics.
Mm-hmm.
Just quick, another quick analogy. I am never going to understand what's on the menu at the restaurant by studying the chemistry and physics of the ink and the paper. It's just they're two different disciplines.
Exactly, and I mean, it also comes down to it almost would vary from individual to individual. I mean, do you like making money? Do you love your work? I mean, it really more does vary from individual to individual, whether it will bring you happiness or not. But I mean, it ultimately is not the issue, really.
Mm-hmm.
Husband, and definitely kids, is a drain on your productivity and resources. And anyway, in this culture, apparently it's irrational to limit yourself to just one person. Might as well just...
And there's the thing. Under a voluntary capitalist system, you decide what's best for you. Now, if I'm a traditionalist, as I am, again, I share many traditional values with Lauren, but I would say that if I allow other people to make their own free decisions, I'm free. I can advise them, hey, if you make that decision, I don't think it's going to work out for you. And they can say, screw you, man, I'm making my own decisions. Well, the thing is, if I'm right, their decisions aren't going to work out for them, and they will face the natural consequences. Only if governments step in with welfare states and everything else and bail them out will this not be the case. A traditionalist should encourage people to make voluntary transactions, because if the traditionalist is right, everything they predict is going to come true. It's in fact government stepping in, ridding people of the natural consequences of their action, bailing them out. That is what allows people to persist in their belief that the traditionalist is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Use Tinder and count yourself lucky to live in a free society, you prude. Does it serve needs related to esteem? Does anyone feel esteemed in an assembly line or in a job where their boss treats them like they should be grateful the company has room in the budget for free coffee? Does it serve needs relating to self-actualization?
Actually, pause it for 1 second.
Self-actualizing in a gig economy.
Again, well, and even Lauren bringing up the whole assembly line thing. Well, here's something that capitalism does do. It does increase automation. I mean, we've seen massive amounts of increase of automation because of capitalism in industrial work and other things, which actually release people to do more productive and empowering jobs, basically empowering themselves and empowering their individuality. So, Lauren, there is that. Just saying.
Economy, or in a world where you can lose your job the instant you self-actualize in a way that Twitter doesn't like. Also, on a side note, Marxism may have told women that being wives and mothers was shameful, but it was capitalism that broadcast that message so that all those women would enter the workforce and drive down the wages of their husbands and sons. Seriously, can we really say that it's all just government systems that have ruined our happiness? Or perhaps could Some of us admit our work life, addiction to media, obsession with pursuing the next shiny product, the constant demands that we buy things to look a certain way, feel a certain way, watch this, buy that, play that, drink this, eat that. Could it perhaps be this mass consumerism and work-life imbalance that has also ripped us from our family, community, and loved ones, and ourselves in many ways?
Okay, again, and I'm in many ways inclined to agree. I think excessive time on social media is generally going to be harmful. I think making many decisions is generally going to be harmful. Is it true that other people and other groups of people affect the way we think about these things? Of course it is. Is it true that there are some corporations that benefit from political messages like feminism that I think are wrong on their face? Of course it's true. But again, whose job is it to realize this? Is it your job to force everyone to do what you know to be better for them than they do? Or when they make these decisions and it causes these negative consequences, is it the individual who must then decide, hey, all these decisions I'm making, they're not working out. It's making me less happy. And yes, feminism is one of my favorite things to criticize. Go back and look at all my videos on the subject. Women are more unhappy now than ever. But is it the fault of capitalism? Is it a fault of these corporations? Or is it those women who really need to look themselves in the mirror and realize, I made these decisions. I can't change the past, but now I can either move forward and make better choices, or I can just keep making the same choices and be unhappy. I don't think it's my job to decide for you what you should or shouldn't do. But if I allow you the freedom to do what you want, you are going to discover it one way or another.
Exactly.
As well. What Hannah Arendt called the vita activa, a state where we must always be busy, never present, and always consuming. It's just soul-destroying. And even if we move on to other factors leading to cultural decay, such as mass immigration with no assimilation, that too has largely been pushed and supported by corporations looking for cheap labor. As for old architecture, the utility of a building being nice relative to its price just doesn't add up. And don't tell me there's not a demand for beautiful buildings when people are flying halfway across the world just to take pictures with them. The problem is that the demand clearly doesn't lead to enough profit. Visual joy of the citizenry in daily life is not a business. This is in large part why the left have won the culture war. They didn't care that their arts degrees weren't particularly profitable, they just wanted to create art. And sure, I'm conceding ground to progressives in some regard, but I'm also not going to sit here and pretend that you can eat an art degree or that it was the arts that doubled our average lifespan. That was absolutely innovation pushed by commercial interests and capitalism.
I'm not necessarily going to disagree with anything she said here. Now, I would say the reason the left won the culture war is because they, for more than a century, they worked to infiltrate the education system, entertainment industry, and the media. Ultimately, really, I'd say the most important of which is education. If you go back, there's a book I've referenced quite a few times on my channel, Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. If you go back to John Dewey, the founder of the American public school system, he said rather explicitly that in order to change the future, we have to control the children, because what children learn in school today, they become the voters of tomorrow. And by controlling the mere existence of the public education system, as well as the left's fundamental underlying control of it, is really why, in my opinion, the left won the culture war. Now, the media, Hollywood, I think all of that contributed to it, but I think strategically, yes, the left was very insidious but also effective in choosing to take over the education system. But I guess I'm not like I said, I'm not necessarily going to try to argue that point exclusively. I'd say, in my opinion, that's why they won the culture war, or at least one of the primary reasons, but I'm not necessarily going to say she's wrong about that particular point.
I wouldn't even say the left won the culture war. I would say it was more espionage than anything. I would say that it wasn't really a win. It was just kind of an espionage mission that they went on. However, on that note, they really did take a page from Orwell. They really did take a quote from Orwell in who controls the future controls the past. Who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the past controls the future.
But the question still arises, what is the point of a long lifespan if increasingly people aren't wanting to live said life? Ultimately, we cannot understate how consumerism makes surviving insultingly easy, but we must also acknowledge it makes living insultingly hard. Now, the last one here, number.
Now again, I think this is a category error. The question of what is the meaning of life? It's a fundamental question every person asks, but it's not one that's going to be answered by economics. It's not going to be answered by science. That is a question for philosophy. And while I love philosophy, believe me, if I ever get around to hosting a philosophy stream where we discuss any of those questions, we could go on for hours, and it's probably why I've held off on it for up to this point. But it's like one of my favorite authors is C.S. Lewis, and I recently came across a quote from him that I think was particularly relevant to the whole COVID-19 debate that's going on today. And the quote goes like this: whether or not if I take a certain action, I will live or die, is a question for the doctor to decide. Whether or not my life is worth living, if I do what the doctor says, is not a question the doctor can answer. And the point he's making is, you can, like, there are scientific questions, there are historical questions, there are economic questions. You can't take those you can't solve philosophical conundrums in those disciplines. It's like saying that if I try to read, I use the example of a menu, but anything written, a novel, a paper book that I have in my hand, I'm never going to learn what that book says by studying the chemistry and physics of the ink in the paper. You're just trying to conflate two different things. Economics was never meant to solve those issues, nor can it.
Exactly. And another thing I wanted to say is she was saying that consumerism makes it fairly easy to live in this world, but is it a life worth living? Well, again, that is a choice left up to the individual. Now, and the thing about it is that in a lot of ways, much of that is, it again, is also the government's fault, because some people, I mean, as you know, in most of the U.S. states, we do not have a right to die. If you are in a hospital and you are on, if you're in their care, in some cases, it is against the law to go against that. In some cases, if doctors actually assume that, that something is life-threatening to you, literally it can be against the law for you to actually leave the hospital and leave their care, or, it can usually be illegal for that, and the individual's choice is taken away. Really, that's really what she should be against here is, yeah, it is, but I mean, forcing people to continue their lives, forcing people to continue that, that really is what the problem is, and taking the individual choice out of it is the problem. Not consumerism itself, but forcing it upon other people and using the initiation of force on individuals to be forced to use that kind of consumerism to extend their lives, even when they don't want to. So, I mean, that really is more the point that she should be looking at, and she's really getting that wrong.
Mm-hmm. And again, I fully support, as someone who shares many of Lauren's same values, I fully support warning people. Tell them, I think there's a reason you should hold the same values I do. I think it'll give you the best, most meaningful life you can. And if you disagree, I think it's going to lead you to, you're going to find life unfulfilling. You may even become suicidal. You're not. Right. It's going to lead to bad choices. And then the decision is left up to them. And I think in the vast majority of circumstances, I'm going to be proven right. I'm going to be vindicated when the person makes bad choices and it turns out wrong. But I think even when you try to use force to stop them, it only compounds the problem. And I'm just going to take a quick example from my own history. So I grew up in a very conservative church. I remember in junior high being told all the evils of pornography and how, if you ever look at pornography, you've committed the unforgivable sin, God's going to smite you. I mean, not literally, but that's kind of the sentiment. I'll tell you this. All the kids in that youth group were, I would say, and studies have borne this out, children who are taught that are in fact 70 times more likely to be addicted to pornography as adults than people who aren't. It's when you tell people you better not do it or else, or I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to force you, I'm going to use force against you to stop you from doing that, it actually increases the likelihood that they do it anyways. Whereas if you just let them do it, now I'm not going to say whether or not it's good, whether or not it is going to lead to those bad consequences is a separate question. But if you let them do it themselves and they discover it on their own, it seems to me they're far more likely to turn around than when you try to use force to stop them.
Exactly.
Number 3, capitalism is indifferent to morality. Capitalism is not
And again, I agree, but morality is a philosophical discussion, not an economic one.
Exactly.
A conservative view of the world. It's not a political view at all, really. It's simply a tool which sways towards the highest bidder. If you live in a culture that is deeply sickened,
and even here, that isn't necessarily true. It's generally true that the highest bidder is able to secure the cooperation of the person who's voluntarily offering what he's looking to buy. But it's about two parties voluntarily making an exchange that is mutually beneficial to them both. The highest bidder isn't always going to be the one who the seller decides to sell to. He might have personal reasons for selling to someone else. It is subjective. It's about individuals deciding what's most valuable to them. Is it true that in a lot of different situations, the thing that the people value the most is the highest bidder? Yes, that's true in many circumstances, but it's not all circumstances, and it's not like a scientific law that is derived from voluntarism or capitalism.
Right.
Products that are both created and sold will sicken with it. They won't save it. They won't pull you out of your moral darkness. Capitalism just amplifies what we as humans desire in our hearts, which is why it has done.
And actually, I see a comment here I want to go over quick. Watching Trains Go By says, wrong, LOL. The eroding of morals early on leaves people without a moral compass after they experiment with life choices. With that moral base in youth, more people come back and fix themselves. And that, I think, an important point to make. If you don't allow people to make morally significant choices, how can they determine what is and is not moral? Right. If someone else has to constantly decide for them what is or is not moral, how are they going to make morally significant choices? They generally won't, it seems to me.
Right.
Very wonderful things, worthy of praise. But if you are a nation that has lost morality, if you are a nation that has lost God, capitalism just becomes the devil's playground. Go ahead, ignore your family and friends so you can work to fund your alcoholism, I don't know, spend all night feeding your porn addiction and buying your way past a girl's modesty, pay for followers to feed your narcissism, why don't you? And go ahead, consume the cheapest product provided by men and women only held to their desks by the factory suicide nets, preventing them from jumping to their own death.
Now, actually here, this is an interesting point, and I'm going to use an example from the Bible, since Lauren is presumably a Christian, I am as well. Whether or not you're a Christian, whether or not you believe these stories are true, let me ask what you think the lesson is meant to be. So in the Old Testament, we see that the nation of Israel comes into the Promised Land, and they're given the Mosaic covenant. The law comes down from God Himself, and He says, if you follow my commandments, you will prosper in the land. If you disregard my commandments, I will turn my back on you, and you will become oppressed by the nations around you. We see, and he leaves the people to that. There is no human central government, at least not until they appoint a king for themselves, but they're essentially left to either listen to what God had to say or abandon it. In the times that they obey and do what God told them to do, they prosper. In the times they disobey, they fall into despair and other nations conquer them. When they turn and repent and go back to doing what's morally right, they are able to overthrow their oppressors and once again prosper. The very lesson there is that when people turn away from morals, they face the consequences of their actions. And again, I would agree with Lauren. If people make immoral, bad decisions, there are going to be a lot of negative consequences. But can you stop that? But how do you stop that? By trying to force them to do otherwise, or allow them to face the natural consequences of their own actions? I would argue it is far more effective at getting people to actually do what she believes is right, to let them face those consequences, than by forcing them to do otherwise. Forcing them to do otherwise only makes them rebel and convince themselves that it's not real, that you're still wrong. You there, Night Shift?
Yeah, I'm there. I just had to do something really quick. And
okay.
Yeah, I do agree. And I mean, honestly, I mean, she's also making a huge assumption that everyone's coming at this from a Christian moralist perspective, when, in all honesty, most countries, and you know, I mean, most people actually come at it from a secularist perspective. And I mean, the ideas of morality kind of change more or less on those ends. So, I mean, she's really coming. I mean, my only point is she's really coming at this from a very narrow-minded mindset of morality. I'm just saying.
I believe, well, I share her views on morality, largely speaking. I believe that I will never successfully convince someone who disagrees with me that my morals are right by pointing a gun at him. I think it'll be far more effective to let him live his life, and when my life turns out better than his, well, I'd say I'm vindicated.
There you go.
I'm sorry, but there is a reason that even the most stringent conservatives like Sir Roger Scruton often describe themselves as reluctant capitalists. Because modern capitalism is a deeply sick system. And progressives are not wrong to call that out.
Is the system sick, or is it the people that are making bad decisions?
You cannot argue with them on where they are.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of people are making bad decisions. But again, is it my job to tell everyone what they should do because I know what's better than they do? Or should I simply advise them and then let them face the natural consequences of their actions and not bail them out?
Right.
They're wrong. You can't even begin to explain to them that this is crony capitalism. You can't even begin to argue that it's a user issue and application rather than the system itself without acknowledging that there is an issue in the first place. Truth is not found in political absolutes. It's not found in platitudes either. As one of my most respected mentors and professor, Ron Dart, always reminds me, truth is often found in the tension. That is to say, not absolutes, nor even the center, but constantly questioning and challenging ourselves and our beliefs. And as I mentioned at the start of this video, some of you may be itching to call me a socialist for publishing this, but consider...
I'm not itching to call her a socialist. I would call her a statist.
Yeah.
And I think really socialism or capitalism isn't the real dichotomy. The real dichotomy is freedom or statism.
Mm-hmm.
Consider that you're watching this video on YouTube. Literally any minute, with no warning, YouTube could alter its terms of service to include a provision that lets them ban this video, and then do it. How does this make them any better than countries who censor political dissidents? My banning from the UK cut me off from speaking face-to-face with 68 million people, potentially. And even if I had a primetime slot at the BBC and attracted the entire viewership of the UK, I still wouldn't get a fraction of the influence and reach that's available on YouTube.
Pause it for just 1 second.
8.6 billion.
Yes, Lauren. That's why we have things like BitChute, BitTubers, and other social media programs that might not be as large as YouTube, corporate cronyism much, but they do still exist. And because of capitalism, they do still exist. Whereas in socialism, it would just be something like State Tube or Government Tube or Murica Tube or whatever. No, there are social media alternatives that actually do have laxer regulations and actually even encourage more freedom of speech than YouTube does. Basically because, again, of capitalism.
The voluntary transactions of people
There you go.
that are both mutually beneficial. It's if you have any government at all, and eventually it's going to keep moving towards an authoritarian system like China where it gets rid of all those interactions, and you do have State Tube.
Monthly visits worldwide. Literally more engagement than there are people on planet Earth. Their daily views are in the billions, and YouTube can cut you off from that audience anytime it likes, for any reason, with no warning or explanation. And because of the power of its lobbying, there is currently no chance to fix that problem. And if you complain about that massive, unaccountable, super governmental power over worldwide speech, you get accused of supporting literal centralized planning of all resources in society by some Republicans.
Okay, and here I think I'm not going to accuse Lauren of supporting that. What I'm not saying and I think the real criticism is not this. By supporting any level of statism at all, you necessarily support communism and central planning. No, I don't think that's the case. My question is this. Once you support any statism, that is, in some sense you agree that the initiation of force is inherently just, there is inherently a group of people that is allowed to initiate force but no one else is, how are you going to consistently argue that it has gone too far once it crosses whatever line you say is too far?
Right.
Because, again, I don't believe the average Republican believes in central planning. The average Republican says it's okay for government to define, it's okay for government to stop homosexuals from getting married. It's okay for government to stop people from doing drugs. It's okay for government, pick whatever issue, but it's not okay for government to control children's education. It's not okay for government to censor certain persons. It's not okay for government to do this or that. Again, right. Why? If it's okay for government to use force, why is it only okay for it? How are you going to consistently argue that government is only allowed to do the things you want it to do?
Right.
As if there is no middle ground between, hey, I think corporations have gone a bit far and submitting yourself to Big Brother, which is why I say this to any in my audience currently itching to call me a socialist. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means.
And I kind of would agree. I think the issue isn't social. You're either a capitalist or a socialist. I think it's the degree to which do you inherently believe there is a group of people that can legitimately initiate force against others. If you do, why is it that it's only justified in doing the things you want to do it to? And how are you going to argue it's not allowed to do something else when it in fact has the power to do so?
Right.
Now, do I have a solution for this? Great question. No, I got nothing.
There you go, people. So she's made all these criticisms, but at the end she says, well, so what's your solution, Lauren? She doesn't have one. Okay, then what was the point of making this video?
Right.
Again, I agree. There are a lot of bad people in the world. No matter what, there are always going to be people who seek to initiate force against others, who seek to violate the rights of others. You're never going to get rid of that. The question is, if you say that they're at least in a society with no government and everyone acknowledges that's wrong, you have a much better chance of being able to defend yourself than if you have a centralized group of people with a monopoly on force who the majority of the population agrees is justified in doing so. No, actually, and I don't want to run down this rabbit trail too far, but one of my favorite movies that I rewatched the other day was The Dark Knight with Christian Bale. In my opinion, his series of Batman is one of the best Batman films that's ever been made. But in The Dark Knight, at the end he's trying to stop the Joker. The Joker is so evil and has been thinking so far ahead. How do you stop him? And he working together with his friend Lucius Fox, they create this giant computer that hacks every person's cell phone in the city and creates like a giant echolocation map so they can locate the Joker anywhere in the city. And Lucius Fox appropriately points out, you've created a piece of technology that could fundamentally violate the privacy and rights of everyone. I don't want any part of this. And Batman says, well, yeah, but we've got to, so dire is the circumstance, we've got to stop the Joker. And I would argue it's a fictional story, but in that case, you're under pretty dire circumstances. What choice does he have? So he goes forward with it. But of course, at the end of the movie, then, when all is said and done, they've stopped the Joker. He tells Lucius, when this is all over, type your name in and walk away. It comes up, he types his name into the screen, and the entire machine blows up. And what I see there is Batman inherently acknowledged what he was doing was violating people's rights. It was wrong. He did it only because he thought so dire was the circumstances, he had no other choice. It was the lesser of two evils, and he acknowledges that by destroying the machine when it's over. I am willing to acknowledge, could there be extremely dire situations? So dire are the consequences that I have no choice but to initiate force against someone else? There could be. I'm going to acknowledge there could be extreme situations where the initiation of force may be the lesser of two evils. However, if I believe that situation ever comes where I just have no choice but to use force to stop a greater evil, I'll go ahead and do so. But I'll lay down my arms afterwards and face whatever the consequences may be. It's arguing that because there may be such dire circumstances that the initiation of force is simply necessary in that circumstance is like arguing because I may need to steal food to save my starving mother's life, I should therefore be allowed to steal all the time. That's essentially the argument for government.
All right.
Because there may be extreme circumstances where the initiation of force is the lesser of two evils, therefore I should be able to initiate force all the time.
Sorry, guys. But to be fair, This is probably why we've let things get so whack. Because all of our solutions to these problems with capitalism throughout history have created much bigger problems for us than the initial one we were trying to solve, including the death and torment of millions. So I guess I can see why people are a bit hesitant to brainstorm on this one, but I would rather honestly speak about the flaws in capitalism with my head held high than pretend it's perfect by burying my head in the sand, I guess.
And I don't, like me and Knight just said, we're not pretending it's perfect. No system is going to be perfect. Anarchism is no guarantee that people will not rape, murder, and steal. Government is a guarantee that some people will.
And we can't really ignore these problems forever, as the more we pretend they don't exist, the more people will turn to radical solutions rather than reasonable healing. But yeah, I just wanted to start a conversation there, and I'm glad I got that off my chest, comrades.
All right. Fair enough, Lauren. You just wanted to start a conversation. So, before I close this live stream, I would just like to say, Lauren Southern, if you happen to be watching this, which I somehow doubt, but hey, it could happen, I would like to invite you to come on my channel. Let's have a dialogue. Again, I am a fan of yours, your YouTube channel. I've been watching your videos for a long time. You are one of the original inspirations that got me to start my YouTube channel. In fact, way back when I had only like 25 subscribers, I made a video called Beauty and Brains, Lauren Southern, which I outright endorsed you. And I still agree, you got a lot of good things to say. I know I'm small. I am still majorly small potatoes compared to you, but again, I had like 25 subscribers when I made that. I have more than 6,000 now. So if you are at all willing to continue the dialogue, I would like to invite you on my channel so we can have that dialogue.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Night Shift agrees.
Oh, yeah, I do. I would love to be on that stream if she ever comes on.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Hope you've learned something. And as always, that is my 2 cents. You can take it for what it's worth.